About 7 or 8 months ago, I posted my first full-length video on this YouTube channel. It was a tutorial about how I painted my Blood Angels in a Grimdark sponging or stippling technique. By the time that video came out, I had already worked on that recipe quite a bit. It was the one that I used on my first Blood Angels, so the learning curve was pretty steep, but being taught miniature painting through a mix of other YouTube creators and trial and error, a recipe that I'm sure many of us can commiserate with, things like color theory weren't really my strong suit. Since starting the YouTube channel though, I've jumped in with both feet to try to understand my colors a little bit better. And I think I'm just about ready to share the new and improved Blood Angel scheme with you all. So, welcome to Gone Hollow Minis, my name is Colt, and today we're painting Blood Angels in a remastered Grimdark sponging style. Okay, so before we get into this, I want to talk about the reasons that I made some of these changes. If you're just here for the recipe, feel free to find the timestamp that you're looking for in the description. No hard feelings. But this is what the old style looked like, and yeah, there's some problems here. So time for a bit of self-criticism. Firstly, the saturation is off. Pushing up into orange for the highlights keeps things nice and bright, sure, but sticking only to darker reds mixed with more darker paints in the shadows makes it read a little bit flat. There's contrast between the highest highlights and the darkest shadows, but still. Every color used is exactly the color you'd expect, if that makes sense. It's red, shaded with red, and highlighted with red and a little bit of orange mixed in. This was extremely present in my first Blood Angels, which are more of an unsightly brown. Desaturation is great to push the gritty tone, but not at the cost of the armor actually looking like the color it's supposed to be. Not to mention, the highlights being orange creates a bit of a tricky situation. If you don't mix in enough orange, the mini will end up in that brown territory. But mix in too much, or don't thin that mix enough, and you jump straight into another color entirely. It's a balance that you have to strike that's just a little trickier than I think is actually worth. I think I can do better, opening up the idea with more technical processes to fully render the effect, instead of just stopping at a few grainy layers. So, with this new iteration, we're after a couple different things. First and foremost, it has to actually be red. Not orange, not an unsightly brown, a deep Blood Angels red. Additionally, I want this painting process to be easily opened up to more in-depth and technical techniques, particularly if they can be powerful, effective, optional steps that we can use on our character models while leaving off our base troops. So let's get into it by going over our tools and materials first. Here are the acrylics that we're going to be using. Pro Acryl Black Primer, Army Painter Basilisk Red, Citadel Mephiston Red, Pro Acryl Bold Pyrrole Red, Citadel Druchii Violet, Army Painter Angelic Red, Army Painter Brigandine Brown, Citadel Abaddon Black, and Vallejo Matte and Gloss Varnish. On this list there are 3 standouts: Basilisk Red, Druchii Violet, and Bold Pyrrole Red. The first 2 are perhaps the most notable achievement in my knowledge of color theory. Instead of using drab browns for our shadows, we're going to push further into colder purple tones. You can use whichever similar tones you can find in your preferred paint range, but using shades on the cooler side of red is important. It'll contrast even better with our warmer highlight tones, start cold and warm. The other, and arguably the most important paint in this whole process, is Pro Acryl Bold Pyrrole Red. This is the key to solve our highlighting issues. This is a super bright red that will really punch our highlights up without dipping into orange or pink. It can be like nuclear red if you're careful with it, but we won't need to go that far, don't worry. It's also a fairly transparent paint which will help in building up our layers. And now for the weapons at our disposal. In the last video I said that you could use either a sponge or a brush, and that's still true, but there's a little bit more to it than just that. See, there's more than just one type of sponge. Here I have the 2 different varieties that I use. One is a cosmetic sponge. This has tighter, softer cells that leave much less of a texture. You can get these in squares like this, or in a kind of bulb shape that usually has an even tighter sponge, to the point that people can make seamless blends with one sponge alone. I usually prefer the square type as I want a little bit more texture. For some final touch-up texture layers, we can use this. This is just standard packing foam. Much bigger cells, much more texture. This is great for those final bits of weathering and texture, but the cosmetic sponge is still usually better for getting those first few layers down. And then, of course, we still have an old ratty brush for the finer details and nooks. This is still definitely important to have around, since no matter how small we make our sponge, there will still be some details that we won't be able to reach. The old ratty bristles help to keep that cohesive texture. And finally, these are the materials we'll be using for some of the optional steps. These aren't required, but are used to punch our paint scheme up with some pretty easy and effective steps, but more on those later. Let's finally get to some painting. Today I'll be working on this Blade Guard Veteran. Not only are these models the objectively coolest Primaris unit, it'll also do a really good job of showing off pretty much every color on the Blood Angels repertoire, so you can see how our red armor fits into context. We're going to start with a black prime. No need to be picky here. I recently switched to using Pro Acryl Black Primer through the airbrush, but before that I used a regular rattle can spray, and I didn't have any issues so long as I shook the can well enough. Once we've got a nice even layer of primer on, we can start layering with a base of Army Painter Basilisk Red. This will set up a nice cooler red tone for our shadows. For these base layers, we're going to be using a piece of that makeup sponge. I'm just going to tear off a chunk and grip it in some cross-lock pliers, with the smooth, flat part facing out. We want to make sure our paint here is nice and thin. Not too thin that it pools and has poor coverage, but we don't want it to be too thick either, since that'll leave texture on our miniature. Now we'll dip our sponge into our Basilisk Red, dab some of it out onto a paper towel so we don't have any puddles, and then take it to our miniature. We're applying this with a stippling motion, which will apply paint onto our raised surfaces while leaving our black primer in the crevices and recesses. If you're worried about your primer being visible, you can always hit the mini with a layer of black acrylic first. However, you shouldn't need to go back and fix anything with that primer layer, so color matching shouldn't be an issue. After that, we can move into our next layer, Mephiston Red. I'm going to apply this with a similar motion and a similar tool. This is that same makeup sponge, but twisted into the cap of a paintbrush instead. This helps me hold on to a smaller piece that will make applying these more specific layers easier. Speaking of layers, I want to take the chance to explain volumetric highlights a little bit better than I did in the last video. See, the end goal of miniature painting is to come up with a cohesive miniature that looks like it's all in one scene, but in order to do that, we have to understand the simpler shapes that our miniatures are made out of. So behold, a Space Marine. This is obviously oversimplified, but it's just to get you thinking about how to highlight specific basic shapes. 3D Builder might not have the most accurate lighting simulation, but you can see how light is bouncing off of our objects in different ways. There isn't one flat point of highlight. The rounder pauldrons get more rounded highlights. The cylindrical arms, legs, and torso get more linear highlights at the point of the shape's curve. Keeping these shapes in mind as we work on our highlights will help our miniature look like he's set in a particular setting, with real light bouncing off of his armor, as opposed to being in the flat studio lighting like you see on box art minis. So as we're applying our Mephiston Red, we need to keep track of where our light is coming from and what shapes we're hitting. It's helpful to keep a mental idea of where your light source might be coming from while you do this, so that different highlight patterns on the different shapes will still appear to be coming from the same light source. So, as you can see, places like the pauldrons get more rounded highlights higher to the top. Other places, like the shins, get more linear highlights traveling along the outside edge. Make sure to not cover too much with this layer. We want some of the Basilisk Red left in the recesses to keep our shadow tones visible. Focus on the center of the armor panels and not the edges. Leaving darker colors on the edges of our panels will help the armor to read as dirty and weathered, without the crisp edge highlighting that so many of us are used to. And again, make sure to thin your paints and dab the excess away before taking it to your model. The final base layer for our armor is Pro Acryl Bold Pyrrole Red. Same deal here, but now we need to be extra careful with our highlights. You want this to be the most specific of the highlight layers, applied to the brightest points within our previous Mephiston Red. This is a fairly transparent paint, as many reds tend to be, so don't be worried if it takes a couple of layers. Next, we're going to go back in and reinforce our shadows. I did this with Druchii Violet, but you can use any purple shade paint. Not only will this darken our recesses and crevices, but the colder purple tones will work well with our previous Basilisk Red base layer, reinforcing those colder tones and giving our highlight layers even more contrast. I'm doing this by brushing some Druchii Violet into my recesses and towards the bottom of my armor panels, then going back in with a damp brush to smooth and feather the transition out a little bit better. Now that we've reinforced our shadows, time to reinforce our edges and highlights. We can do this with a little careful edge highlighting, using Pyrrole Red mixed with a little bit of Angelic Red. We don't want to do every edge, but hitting the most prominent corners and edges of our armor with scratchy highlights will build up a weathered, chipped look to the armor. We can also reinforce this with a little bit of Brigandine Brown, darkened with a little bit of black. Apply this in little scratches on some of your more prominent weathered edges to really make it seem like the scratches and gouges are worn into the armor. Now, if you're just here for the quick army painting side of things, you're more than welcome to just stop here. These next steps are more like optional add-ons that you can throw on if you want to make a specific miniature stand out. The next big thing we're going to do is an oil wash, but there's a couple steps to get there. First, we'll hit the whole model with a layer of gloss varnish. This will do a few things all at once. Firstly, it'll prevent our oils and white spirit from lifting any of our acrylic off. Second, it'll help to get our oil wash to flow better into our recesses, which will keep our highlights bright and our recesses cool and dark. Thirdly, it'll give us a nice smooth surface to apply our transfers to. Transfers really don't work over any sort of texture, so this layer will help to keep everything nice and smooth. It's one of the big secrets in making decals look like they're painted on. Just be sure to seal them with another layer of gloss before you move on. Once that's dried and cured, we can do the wash itself. This is just a little violet that I mixed with a tiny bit of black to darken it. If we just used a dingy brown or black like most Grimdark oil washes are, we'd end up losing all of that saturation we just worked so hard for. Mix this with enough white spirit to make it a thin wash. We don't want to over-thin this because it'll separate our oil paint, but if it's too thick it'll be harder to remove and might stain our model a little bit more. But once it's on, we can leave it to dry for somewhere around 20 minutes, and then come back with some white spirit and some cotton buds to remove it from our higher spots. We just want to leave it in the lowest shadows and in the places like panel lines, so we'll be removing a lot of it. Once you do that though, make sure to leave the model to dry completely. We don't want any wet oils or white spirit interfering with our final layers. And finally, to kill the shine, we can hit the whole model with a layer of matte varnish. This is another important step in creating a weathered atmosphere on the model. A unified matte finish does wonders to sell the effect. You can also go through now and fix any highlights that were dulled a bit by the wash. This guy actually turned out okay, but on this Terminator I did go back through with some Pyrrole Red to re-establish my highlights. When I did this for a bit of extra texture, I used more open cell packing foam instead of the makeup sponge. And that will finally wrap up my recipe for my remastered Blood Angels Red. There are of course other details in the model, but to be entirely honest, there's nothing really special with how I painted those. The one last thing I did want to mention was using pigments. I found these palettes at a local craft store and they're super helpful to add a last layer of weathering to unify our miniature and its base together. All I do here is work some pigment into a brush, dust it over the feet and lower legs of my mini, do the same to some of my basing details, then go back in with a damp brush to remove the pigment from the raised surfaces. You can use a pigment fixer if you're worried about it coming off, but the surface finish of our matte varnish does a pretty good job of keeping things in place. I used to mess around with varnish and fixers, but I think I've been converted to the all-natural approach. But with that, our red armor is complete, so all that's left is to show you all how it all comes together on the finished miniature. I am super happy with how this recipe turned out. I've had a kind of love-hate relationship with the whole Grimdark sponging technique. I love the way it looks, but it can feel like a dead-end technique without too much room to grow. But in reapproaching the style through the lens of growing my skills and working in more technical processes, not only have I rediscovered my love for this style of painting, but I think I've come even closer to my original goal with the first recipe. Balancing the bright colors of the Space Marines with the gritty, dingy environments they fight in. Creating contrast between the wear and tear of war and the aesthetic upkeep that Astartes gives to their warplate. Thank you all so much for watching this tutorial on my remastered recipe for painting weathered Blood Angels. I hope this gave you some ideas on how to revamp your own army projects, or that at the very least, this video was a little bit easier to stomach than my first one was. It was a little rough. But feel free to comment if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer. Leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe and turn notifications on to never miss an episode, and until we meet again friends, be safe, be kind, and don't you dare go hollow.